A continent stood in the shadow of a single, terrifying power. This is the story of the German Empire, a nation forged from 300 pieces. By the end, you will understand the precise sequence of brilliant moves and fatal blunders that can build a superpower and then destroy it. How did a land of princes and poets transform into an industrial juggernaut in just 2 generations? And why did its own leaders steer it directly into the abyss? We are about to trace the entire arc from fractured chaos to global dominance and finally to a sudden, shocking collapse. What does the rise and fall of an empire tell us about the nature of power itself? Think of a map of Europe in the early 1800s, but with the borders drawn by a committee of rival cartographers. This was the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 sovereign states. But that official number is deceptive. If you counted every tiny principality, every independent city, and every noble's estate with its own laws, the true figure was closer to 300 distinct pieces. It was less a nation and more a sprawling, intricate puzzle where the Kingdom of Hanover used different coins than the Duchy of Baden, and the army of Saxony answered to no one but the King of Saxony. 2 powers loomed over this fragmented landscape, each believing they held the true solution to what historians call the German question. To the south, the Austrian Empire, ancient and vast, its Habsburg rulers considered themselves the traditional leaders of the German world. But their attention was divided across a dozen different nationalities from Hungary to Italy. To the north, the Kingdom of Prussia was a state built like a barracks, all disciplined efficiency and military grit, hungry for influence and convinced that the future belonged to them. The smaller states, places like Bavaria or Württemberg, were caught in the middle, proud of their own traditions and deeply suspicious of being swallowed by either rival. This was the great political mystery of the age. Who would solve the puzzle of German unity? Would it be the old cultural empire of Austria, trying to preserve a conservative past? Or would it be the sharp, modernizing force of Prussia, ready to forge something entirely new? The stage was set not for a simple merger, but for a high-stakes contest where only one detective could claim the prize. Into this chaotic puzzle walked a man who carried a blueprint in one hand and a hammer in the other. His name was Otto von Bismarck, a Prussian aristocrat from the old Junker class, born to manage vast estates and uphold tradition. But Bismarck was no ordinary country squire. He was a political genius of a particularly ruthless variety, a man who viewed the delicate dance of diplomacy as a form of warfare by other means. His reputation preceded him, a blend of sharp intellect, towering arrogance, and a willingness to shatter any convention that stood in his path. He famously declared that the great questions of the day would not be settled by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron. This was not a metaphor. It was a statement of principle, a doctrine called realpolitik, where cold, hard calculation of power mattered more than ideals or moral posturing. For Bismarck, politics was a chessboard, and he was prepared to sacrifice any piece to secure a checkmate. So what was his grand design? Was this enigmatic figure a visionary patriot dreaming of a unified German fatherland? Or was he merely a Prussian expansionist in disguise, using the idea of unity as a tool to make his own kingdom the undisputed master of Central Europe? The truth, as with the man himself, was complex and layered. Bismarck understood that raw Prussian ambition would frighten the smaller German states straight into the arms of Austria. He needed a cause that could unite them, a common enemy they could rally against. His ultimate goal was a Germany united, yes, but united under Prussian leadership with the Austrian rival permanently sidelined. He would become the architect of an empire, a master strategist whose every move for the next 3 decades would be a calculated step toward that singular, formidable vision. The age of speeches was over. The age of iron was about to begin. Bismarck's first move was a masterclass in political deception. the complex issue of the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, two territories with tangled loyalties between Denmark and the German Confederation, provided the perfect opportunity. To the outside world, it seemed like a simple matter of defending German-speaking peoples under Danish rule, a cause that could unite all the German states. But Bismarck saw something far more valuable, a chance to maneuver his greatest rival into a position of weakness. His strategy was audacious. He would not confront Austria directly, not yet. Instead, he invited them in as a partner, proposing a joint Prussian and Austrian military action to liberate the duchies from Denmark. The resulting war in 1864 was short and decisive, a swift demonstration of modern military power against a much smaller opponent. But here lies the central mystery of the entire affair. Why would a man intent on sidelining Austria willingly share a victory with them? The answer reveals the trap. The peace treaty was a masterpiece of deliberate ambiguity. The two duchies were placed under the joint administration of Prussia and Austria, but the agreement was so poorly defined regarding borders and authority that conflict was virtually guaranteed. It was like two rival detectives forced to share a single office with one key piece of evidence sitting on the desk between them. Bismarck had not solved the Schleswig-Holstein question, he had weaponized it. By luring Austria into a shared conquest, he created a ticking clock. The vague settlement meant that every minor dispute over taxes, troop movements, or legal jurisdiction would now be a flashpoint between the two German giants. He had turned a foreign conflict into a domestic time bomb, one he could detonate at the moment of his own choosing. The First War had been a partnership, but only to set the stage for the second, which would be an elimination. The ticking clock finally exploded in the summer of 1866. Bismarck, having carefully cultivated the dispute over Schleswig and Holstein, now pushed it to its breaking point. He accused Austria of violating their joint administration agreement, a charge designed to be impossible to resolve through negotiation. When Austria appealed to the old German Confederation for support, Bismarck declared the Confederation itself null and void. It was a breathtaking legal and political gambit, turning the entire established order into an act of war. The stage was now set for a direct, brutal confrontation to decide once and for all who would lead the German world. This would not be a war of attrition. It was a lightning strike, a demonstration of a new kind of warfare. The Prussian army, reformed and modernized, possessed a secret weapon that was not a secret at all, but a revolutionary piece of technology everyone else had underestimated. It was the breech-loading needle gun. While the Austrian infantry had to stand up, bite open a paper cartridge, pour gunpowder down the muzzle of their musket, ram a bullet home, and then fire, a Prussian soldier could simply drop a cartridge into the breech at the rear of the rifle, close it, and shoot. He could reload while lying flat on the ground, firing 5 shots to the Austrians' 1. This was not just a better gun, it was a complete transformation of battlefield tactics. Dense, colorful columns of troops, the pride of European armies for centuries, became nothing more than slow-moving targets. The two forces collided on July 3, 1866, near the Bohemian village of Königgrätz. For hours, the battle raged in a confused, bloody stalemate. The Austrian forces, brave and numerous, pressed hard against the Prussian lines. It appeared the day might be lost for Prussia until, in the late afternoon, the Crown Prince's Second Army arrived on the Austrian flank after a grueling forced march. The sudden appearance of fresh troops armed with those relentless needle guns shattered Austrian morale. The orderly retreat dissolved into a panicked rout. In a single, thunderous day, the military power of the Austrian Empire was broken. The road to Vienna lay open, and the Prussian generals hungered for a triumphant march into the enemy's capital. But here, Bismarck revealed the second, more cunning layer of his strategy. He confronted his own king and the army high command, demanding they halt. He argued passionately against a humiliating peace, against seizing Austrian territory. His goal had never been to destroy Austria but to remove it from German affairs. A vengeful, crippled Austria would become a permanent enemy, likely allying with France or Russia for revenge. A spared Austria, however, could one day be a useful partner. This was realpolitik at its most coldly brilliant. The Peace of Prague was astonishingly lenient. Austria lost no territory in its German-speaking heartlands, paid only a modest indemnity, and was simply expelled from the old German Confederation, which was formally dissolved. With Austria gone, Bismarck immediately built a new structure from the wreckage. He created the North German Confederation, a federal state dominated by Prussia. It had a common parliament, a unified economy, and most importantly, a unified army under Prussian command. All the German states north of the main river were now bound irrevocably to Berlin. Yet the southern states Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden remained outside, nervously independent. Bismarck had solved half the puzzle with breathtaking efficiency. He had eliminated his rival, restructured northern Germany under Prussian control, and done it all without creating a bitter, vengeful enemy in Vienna. But a final, formidable obstacle still remained to the south and west, watching these events with growing alarm. The French Empire of Napoleon III had no intention of allowing a powerful, unified Germany to rise on its border. The southern German states now stood as a curious anomaly, watching the new North German Confederation from a cautious distance. Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden were culturally distinct, largely Catholic, and deeply attached to their ancient independence. The idea of submitting to the Protestant militaristic king in Berlin filled them with profound suspicion. For Bismarck, this was the final, delicate piece of the unification puzzle. He could not simply conquer these fellow German lands without turning them into permanent enemies, yet he could not leave them outside the new Germany, vulnerable to the influence of other powers. His solution was not diplomacy, but a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. He needed a threat so powerful, so universally feared, that it would override centuries of regional pride and force the South to run into Prussia's arms for protection. That threat, of course, was France. For generations, the French had been the historic enemy of the German peoples, a source of invasion and domination. Bismarck would now craft a scenario where France appeared not just as a rival, but as an imminent aggressor. The opportunity arrived in the summer of 1870, revolving around a vacant Spanish throne. A distant relative of the Prussian king, a man named Leopold, was offered the crown. France's Emperor Napoleon III was furious at the prospect of a Prussian prince ruling Spain, which would effectively encircle France. He demanded that King Wilhelm I, who was vacationing at the spa town of Bad Ems, permanently renounce any Hohenzollern claim to the Spanish throne. Wilhelm, a reasonable man, politely refused but ended the discussion amicably. He sent a telegram to Bismarck in Berlin detailing the polite but firm encounter. This mundane diplomatic cable, known as the Ems Dispatch, landed in Bismarck's hands like a gift. He saw its potential instantly. With a few precise surgical edits, he transformed a dry report into a document of explosive insult. He shortened the text, sharpened the language, and altered the tone to make it seem as though the French ambassador had been brusquely dismissed by the Prussian king. The revised version gave the impression of a deliberate public snub. Bismarck then released his edited version to the press, knowing exactly what would happen next. In Paris, the edited dispatch was read as a calculated humiliation. French public opinion, already inflamed by nationalist newspapers, erupted in demands for war. Napoleon III, his own political position weak, felt he had no choice but to respond to the perceived provocation. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. Bismarck had achieved the impossible. He had made the victim look like the aggressor. Across the German states, from the industrial north to the pastoral south, a wave of patriotic fury unified the people. The very same Bavarians and Württembergers who had distrusted Berlin now saw the French threat as a danger to all Germans. They mobilized their armies alongside Prussia's, answering the call to defend a shared fatherland they had not even realized they possessed. Bismarck's manufactured crisis had forged, in the heat of perceived foreign aggression, the final emotional bond of a nation. The French declaration of war was the trigger Bismarck had so carefully designed, but the conflict itself would be a brutal demonstration of a new kind of military science. The Prussian General Staff, led by the meticulous Helmuth von Moltke, had spent years planning for this exact scenario. Their mobilization was a masterpiece of logistics, moving hundreds of thousands of men and their supplies across newly built railways with a precision France could not match. The German forces, a coalition of northern and southern states fighting together for the first time, moved with a terrifying, coordinated speed. In a series of battles in August 1870, they trapped and shattered the main French armies. The decisive blow came at Sedan on September 1st, where Emperor Napoleon III himself was captured along with over 100,000 of his soldiers. The French Empire collapsed overnight, but the war was not over. A new Republican government in Paris refused to surrender, rallying the nation for a desperate defense. What followed was a grim 4-month siege of the French capital. Paris was surrounded, cut off from the world, and subjected to a relentless bombardment. Inside the city, conditions deteriorated into starvation and despair. By late January 1871, with no hope of relief, the French government was forced to accept the German terms. The victory was total, and the price of unification was about to be paid in a room drenched in symbolism. On January 18, 1871, in the very heart of their conquered enemy's grandeur, the German princes gathered. The location was not Berlin, not Frankfurt, but the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. This was the ultimate stage, chosen with deliberate, breathtaking irony. For centuries, Versailles had been the glittering symbol of French absolutism and dominance over Europe. Its halls echoed with the memory of Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose armies had once ravaged German land. Now, under the crystal chandeliers and between the endless mirrors that reflected their own assembled power, the rulers of Bavaria, Württemberg, Saxony, and 24 other states stood in uniformed ranks. In a brief, solemn ceremony, they proclaimed the King of Prussia, Wilhelm I, to be German Emperor. The mystery of German unity was solved not by popular revolution or democratic vote, but by the decree of princes, cemented by military triumph and national humiliation. The empire was a federation, the German Reich, with a constitution that gave immense power to the emperor and his chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Prussia, representing 2/3 of its territory and population, was the undisputed hegemon. The southern states were now bound within the new structure, their independence surrendered in exchange for security and a share in the glory. Yet in that moment of supreme triumph, a deeper, more unsettling question was born. Can an empire forged in the hall of a humiliated enemy truly hold together? This was not an organic nation grown from shared soil, but a political construct, an artificial alloy of iron and reluctant consent. Its foundation was not mutual affection, but a calculated balance of power, military victory, and fear of a common foe. The new Germany contained deep fractures between North and South, Protestant and Catholic, industrial powerhouse and agricultural province. It was a colossus with a brilliant, ruthless architect at its helm, but one whose internal stresses were merely papered over by the gold leaf of victory. The empire existed, now it had to learn how to live. The Hall of Mirrors fell silent, but the real work of governing this new, unwieldy creation was just beginning. Bismarck now faced a puzzle more complex than any foreign enemy, the internal machinery of the German Empire itself. Its constitution was a masterpiece of political engineering, a blueprint designed to give the illusion of modern democracy while preserving the absolute power of the Prussian crown. At the very top stood the Kaiser, the emperor, who was not merely a figurehead. He held the supreme command of the entire military, the power to appoint and dismiss the chancellor, and the authority to make treaties and declare war. The chancellor, Bismarck himself, answered only to the emperor, not to the people. Yet there was a fascinating, deliberate contradiction built into the system. Alongside this autocratic executive sat the Reichstag, a national parliament elected by universal male suffrage. Every adult German man, regardless of his wealth, could vote for his representative. On paper, this made Germany one of the most democratic nations in Europe, but the reality was a carefully crafted illusion. The Reichstag could debate laws and approve the national budget, but it had no real power over the military or the chancellor's government. Its members could shout and vote, but they could not truly rule. This created a permanent, simmering tension. Why would Bismarck, a man of iron and authority, allow a democratic body to exist at all? The answer lies in his genius for manipulation. The Reichstag served as a pressure valve, a place where public opinion could be heard and managed, and a tool to pit the empire's various factions against one another. And those factions were numerous and loud. The political landscape was a chessboard of competing interests. On the right, the conservatives represented the old Prussian aristocracy, the military, and the Protestant church, fiercely loyal to the emperor. The National Liberals were the party of the booming industrialists and educated middle class, who supported unification and economic modernization but wanted more parliamentary influence. Then there was the Catholic Center Party, a powerful bloc representing the empire's sizable Catholic minority, who deeply distrusted the Protestant-dominated Prussian state and fought to protect the influence of the church. And finally, growing rapidly in the industrial cities, was the Social Democratic Party, advocating for the rights of the working class, a vision that terrified the established order. Bismarck's domestic rule became a continuous, ruthless game of political chess. His strategy was never to ally permanently with one group, but to balance them in a state of controlled conflict. He would court the National Liberals to pass laws building a unified national economy, then pivot to the Conservatives and the Centre Party to crush those same liberals' hopes for greater political freedom. He famously launched a campaign against the Catholic Church called the Kulturkampf or culture struggle, using state power to try and break the Centre Party's influence. When that proved too difficult, he simply reversed course and made peace, turning them into occasional allies. But his greatest preoccupation became the Social Democrats. Viewing socialism as an existential threat to the empire, he devised a dual strategy of suppression and co-option. He banned socialist organizations and publications while simultaneously pushing through pioneering social welfare laws, the first of their kind in the world. He established national health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions. His motive was not charity, but a cold political calculation. By having the state itself provide a safety net, he aimed to steal the socialists' platform and bind the workers' loyalty not to a revolutionary party, but to the paternalistic German Empire. For 2 decades, Bismarck was the master of this intricate game, playing each faction against the others, ensuring that no single group became strong enough to challenge his authority or the emperor's supremacy. The empire functioned not through consensus but through the relentless, cunning management of division. Stability was maintained, but it was a stability built on a foundation of perpetual political warfare, a testament to the fact that the empire's greatest vulnerabilities were not beyond its borders, but within the very chambers where its laws were made. While Bismarck managed the political chessboard with ruthless skill, his first major domestic offensive revealed the limits of raw state power. He turned his focus to what he perceived as a dangerous enemy within, the Catholic Church and its political arm, the Centre Party. In the Chancellor's view, their primary allegiance to the Pope in Rome represented a fundamental threat to the loyalty owed to the new German Kaiser in Berlin. He branded them a Reichsfeind, an enemy of the empire. This launched the Kulturkampf, the culture struggle, a systematic campaign to break the church's independence and crush its political influence. The weapon was a series of harsh laws known as the May Laws. These decrees placed the education of priests under strict state supervision, required all clergy to be German citizens educated in German schools, and gave government panels the power to approve or veto ecclesiastical appointments. The state asserted its right to intervene in nearly every aspect of church administration. The response was swift and severe. Priests and bishops who refused to comply were arrested, fined, or expelled from the country. Church positions went unfilled and religious orders were dissolved. For a time, it seemed Bismarck's iron will might prevail, bending a 2,000-year-old institution to the will of the new German state. But the policy contained a fatal flaw. By attacking the faith of millions of ordinary Germans, Bismarck did not weaken Catholic solidarity, he forged it into steel. The Centre Party, far from being dismantled, saw its support surge. Catholics across the empire, from the Rhineland to Bavaria, rallied behind their persecuted clergy, voting for the Centre in overwhelming numbers as a matter of religious defense. The Kulturkampf transformed the Centre from a political party into a vibrant, defiant community. Bismarck, the ultimate pragmatist, eventually recognized his miscalculation. After a decade of struggle, he quietly began to repeal the most oppressive laws, seeking a truce with the very forces he had tried to destroy. The campaign revealed a critical truth about his governing style. He was willing to wield the full power of the state against any group he deemed a threat to imperial unity, whether from abroad or within, yet it also exposed the boundaries of that power. A nation could be unified by railroads and constitutions, but the private beliefs of its people, their deepest loyalties, could not be so easily commanded by decree. This failed war on the church set a dangerous precedent, demonstrating how quickly the tools of state authority could be turned inward, a lesson that would not be forgotten in the decades to come. The Kulturkampf had exposed the limits of coercion against faith, but a new and far more frightening enemy was rising from the smoke of the empire's own factories. The Social Democratic Party, or SPD, grew with every industrial boom, channeling the frustrations of a new urban working class into a potent political force. They demanded not just better wages, but a fundamental transformation of society itself. To Otto von Bismarck, this was not mere political opposition. It was an existential threat to the very hierarchical order he had built. His initial response was pure, unadulterated iron. In 1878, following two attempted assassinations on the emperor by unstable individuals with vague radical sympathies, Bismarck seized the moment. He pushed through the anti-socialist laws, a sweeping act of repression. The Social Democratic Party was outlawed, its newspapers were shut down, its meetings were banned. Police could arrest and exile its organizers at will. For 12 long years, the party was driven completely underground, forced to operate in secret or from exile. Yet here lies the first part of the mystery. The repression did not destroy the socialist movement, it merely hardened it. Like a plant growing in darkness, the SPD's support among the working class quietly, stubbornly increased. Votes for socialist candidates who now ran as independents steadily rose in every Reichstag election. Bismarck, the master tactician, realized that force alone was failing. So he executed one of the most audacious pivots in political history. If he could not crush the socialists with a stick, he would undermine them with the most generous carrot the world had ever seen. He turned to the very state the socialists wanted to overthrow and used it to preempt their revolution. Between 1883 and 1889, the German Reichstag passed a series of laws that created the blueprint for the modern welfare state. First came health insurance funded by contributions from workers and their employers. Then accident insurance paid for entirely by employers. Finally, old age and disability pensions, a promise of security after a lifetime of labor. These were not acts of charity, they were acts of political warfare. Bismarck himself was brutally candid about his motives. He stated that giving the worker a small state pension would make him far more content and easier to manage than any socialist promise. The goal was to sever the link between the worker's misery and the socialist solution. If the imperial state itself became the provider of security, then loyalty would shift from the party of revolution to the paternal figure of the Kaiser. This is the profound duality that defines his domestic legacy. Was Otto von Bismarck a social reformer ahead of his time, or was he a cynical manipulator who invented the welfare state solely to preserve an authoritarian system? The evidence points overwhelmingly to the latter. His social laws were a masterstroke of control, a way to buy the allegiance of the masses and drain the revolutionary movement of its purpose. He gave workers a stake in the system he led, making them dependent on its continuity. In doing so, he helped ensure the German Empire's stability for a generation, but he also established a dangerous precedent, the idea that the state's benevolence could be a weapon wielded from above to manage dissent from below. The socialist menace was contained, not defeated, and the empire's internal peace was purchased, not earned. This delicate, engineered balance would hold only as long as the architect remained at the controls. The social peace Bismarck engineered was underwritten by an economic miracle of staggering scale. While the Chancellor played his political chess, the German Empire was undergoing a physical transformation so profound it seemed to warp the very fabric of time and space. In just 3 decades, it leapt from a collection of agrarian states into Europe's undisputed industrial superpower, a revolution on steroids fueled by coal, chemistry, and sheer intellectual might. At the heart of this metamorphosis lay the Ruhr Valley, a region that became the empire's roaring engine room. Here, the name Krupp was not just a company, it was a kingdom within a kingdom. What began as a small forge grew into a vertical empire of its own, swallowing coal mines, iron ore fields, and steel mills to create a single, seamless production line. The Krupp works in Essen became a city of fire, a labyrinth of blast furnaces that lit the night sky an eternal orange, producing the steel that built German railways, bridges, and the fearsome artillery pieces that armed its military. This was heavy industry on a mythological scale, but the German genius was not confined to brute force. In the laboratories of the Southwest, a quieter, more alchemical revolution was taking place. Companies like BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst mastered the secrets of synthetic chemistry. They learned to create colors from coal tar, inventing vibrant dyes that freed Europe from dependence on natural indigo and cochineal. Then they went further, synthesizing fertilizers that dramatically boosted farm yields and later pioneering the first pharmaceuticals. This was the birth of the modern chemical industry, a sector where German science reigned supreme. Meanwhile, a new force was literally electrifying the nation. Visionary firms like Siemens and AEG turned electricity from a laboratory curiosity into the pulse of modern life. Siemens brothers built telegraph lines and dynamos, while Emil Rathenau's AEG brought electric light and power into homes and factories. They illuminated city streets, powered new trolley systems, and connected the empire with a growing web of electrical communication. So what were the ingredients of this explosive growth? The foundation was geological fortune, vast deposits of coal and iron ore in the Ruhr and Silesia. But raw materials alone were not enough. Germany possessed a critical human resource, a population shaped by a tradition of rigorous education, producing a steady stream of engineers, chemists, and skilled technicians. The state then actively nurtured this growth, not with a light touch but with deliberate force. It supported the formation of cartels, massive associations of companies that controlled production, set prices, and eliminated domestic competition. These cartels, like the mighty Rhenish Westphalian Coal Syndicate, created giants stable and powerful enough to dominate world markets. The landscape itself was remade in the image of this new power. Cities exploded outward, Berlin transformed from a royal residence into a throbbing metropolis of 2 million, a symbol of frantic progress where tenements sprang up alongside opulent department stores. A new aristocracy arose, not of blood but of capital. Industrial tycoons like Alfred Krupp lived in palatial villas, wielding economic influence that rivaled that of dukes and princes. Yet for every mansion on the hill, there were 1,000 cramped apartments in the shadows. The same economic engine that generated fabulous wealth also created a vast new urban proletariat. Millions flocked from the countryside to the cities for work, finding long hours in deafening factories and returning home to overcrowded slums with inadequate sanitation. The economic miracle thus contained its own devastating contradiction. It bound the nation together with rails and wires, creating unprecedented national wealth and power, while simultaneously tearing the social fabric into two distinct and hostile worlds, the world of the powerful industrialists and the world of the rootless, struggling workers. The very prosperity that fortified the empire also filled the ranks of the socialists Bismarck so feared, creating a powder keg of class resentment that mere state pensions could never fully diffuse. The empire was now a colossus of industry, but it stood on a foundation that trembled with every shift in the economic tide. Yet this industrial colossus, for all its power, cast a surprisingly small shadow on the world map. By the 1880s, the great European scramble for overseas empires was in full frenzy, and Germany had arrived late to the feast. The British lion and the French cockerel had already carved up the most valuable slices of Africa and Asia, leaving behind contested scraps and barren coasts. For Otto von Bismarck, colonies were initially a distraction. He famously dismissed them as expensive luxuries, likening them to the sable fur coats of impoverished Polish nobles, splendid to look at but freezing to wear. His primary focus was always on securing Germany's position in the heart of Europe, not chasing costly adventures in distant jungles. So why did he change his mind? The answer, as always with Bismarck, was pragmatic calculation, not passion for empire. Pressure was building from a new and vocal colonial lobby, a coalition of merchants, nationalist academics, and armchair adventurers who argued that a world power needed a world empire. More importantly, Bismarck saw colonial acquisition as a useful tool for domestic politics. By securing a few overseas territories, he could satisfy this nationalist fervor, give German commerce new markets, and perhaps even forge a common patriotic cause that could bridge the deep divides between Catholics and Protestants, workers and industrialists. His approach was methodical and surprisingly low cost. He did not send vast armies, but instead used a tactic of chartering private companies and then having the German Navy plant the flag to claim protectorates when those companies got into trouble. In this clinical fashion, he acquired German Southwest Africa, a vast, arid territory that is modern Namibia. He claimed German East Africa, the lands that would become Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. He planted outposts in the Pacific, on islands like Samoa and in northeastern New Guinea. These were not the resource-rich prizes of other empires, but they gave Germany its place on the colonial board, a series of strategic dots on the map. It was empire building by spreadsheet, a series of acquisitions meant to solve problems at home, not to project power abroad. This careful, limited approach to world affairs would not survive its architect. When the young, impetuous Kaiser Wilhelm II ascended the throne in 1888, he swiftly dismissed the aging Bismarck 2 years later, declaring he wanted no pilot to guide the ship of state. With Bismarck's restraining hand gone, German foreign policy underwent a radical and dangerous transformation. The new Kaiser was consumed by a brittle, insecure ambition. He envied the global prestige of his British cousins and the vast colonial holdings of France. He demanded a Weltpolitik, a world policy that would secure for Germany what he called its rightful place in the sun, an empire equal to any other. This was no longer about pragmatic acquisitions for domestic gain. It was an emotional, ideological crusade for global status, driven by a deep-seated fear that Germany was being denied its destiny. The centerpiece of this aggressive new posture became a direct challenge to the world's greatest naval power, Great Britain. Wilhelm and his naval secretary, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, embarked on a massive, systematic naval arms race. The plan, enshrined in a series of naval laws, was to build a fleet so powerful that Britain would never dare challenge Germany and would be forced to treat it as an equal partner. Shipyards worked around the clock, launching a new generation of dreadnought battleships, each more heavily armed and armored than the last. The Kaiser's rhetoric matched the ambition of his shipbuilding programs. He spoke of wielding a mailed fist, and his every speech seemed designed to rattle the windows of foreign chancelleries. The effect was catastrophic for Germany's diplomatic position. Where Bismarck had carefully kept France isolated and maintained a complex but functional relationship with Russia, Wilhelm's bluster united them in common fear. Britain, feeling its naval supremacy directly threatened, ended its historic rivalry with France and formed the Entente Cordiale, a friendly understanding. Russia, alienated by German support for its rival Austria-Hungary in the Balkans, drew closer to France and Britain. One by one, the Kaiser's policies slammed shut the doors Bismarck had kept cautiously ajar. Germany, in its quest for a place in the sun, found itself standing alone under a gathering storm, encircled by potential enemies who saw its magnificent new battleships not as symbols of prestige, but as instruments of looming aggression. The empire had traded the subtle, if ruthless, chess of realpolitik for the thunderous, clumsy drumbeat of a parade ground, and the entire continent was beginning to march to the sound of alarm. The new Kaiser's vision for his reign could not tolerate a shadow in the shape of an old man. Wilhelm II was 29 years old, brimming with a restless energy and a conviction that his divine right to rule meant he should actually rule personally and dramatically. The 75-year-old Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, saw the young monarch not as a sovereign to be followed, but as a reckless pupil to be managed. For 2 years, a cold war of memos and muttered objections simmered beneath the glittering surface of court life. The breaking point came over two fundamental pillars of Bismarck's system. The first was domestic. Bismarck wanted to make the anti-socialist laws his tool for suppressing the working-class movement permanent and even more severe. The young Kaiser, however, dreamed of being a different kind of ruler, a social emperor who could win the loyalty of the workers himself. He opposed renewing the laws in their current form, seeing them as a brutal and outdated strategy. The second and far more dangerous rift was over foreign policy. Bismarck had maintained a secret reinsurance treaty with Russia, a delicate agreement to prevent the Tsar from allying with France. Wilhelm, influenced by advisors who disliked the Russians, refused to renew it. He saw Bismarck's intricate web of treaties as dishonest and weak, preferring a simpler, more forceful stance. The clash came to a head in a series of tense meetings in March 1890. The Kaiser demanded to be consulted on all ministerial appointments, a direct challenge to Bismarck's absolute control over the government. The old chancellor, used to treating emperors as instruments of his will, refused. He believed his experience and his legacy gave him the right to govern as he saw fit. The final confrontation was stark. Wilhelm essentially presented Bismarck with an ultimatum: either submit to the royal will or resign. Bismarck, prideful to the end, chose resignation. On March 18, 1890, the architect of the German Empire submitted his dismissal, which the Kaiser accepted with a chillingly brief note of thanks for his long service. The pilot had been dropped overboard. The consequences of this single act of royal impatience were monumental. Europe lost its most brilliant and cautious strategist. Germany was now steered by a captain who valued spectacle over stability, who mistook bluster for strength and personal whim for statecraft. The careful balance of power Bismarck had maintained for a generation, the isolation of France, the understanding with Russia, began to unravel immediately. The non-renewal of the treaty with Russia sent the Tsar straight into the arms of France, creating the very two-front nightmare Bismarck had spent his career preventing. At home, the complex political machine Bismarck had built, which ran on his personal genius for manipulation, began to sputter without its engineer. The dismissal was more than a change of chancellor. It was the moment the German Empire traded its compass for a weather vane, turning direction with every gust of the Kaiser's ambition. The ship was now on a course for storms no one on the bridge truly understood how to navigate. The ship of state now had a new captain who believed the wheel should be turned with dramatic flourishes. Kaiser Wilhelm II was a man of profound contradictions, a personality so theatrical it seemed designed for the front page of a newspaper. He adored uniforms, possessing a wardrobe of hundreds, each meticulously tailored for a different regiment or occasion, allowing him to play the part of the warrior king without ever seeing a battlefield. His public speeches were fiery, filled with talk of a mailed fist and Germany's place in the sun. Yet beneath this bombastic exterior lay a deep, gnawing insecurity. Historians have long noted the impact of a physical disability he worked tirelessly to conceal, a withered left arm caused by a traumatic birth. For a prince in a dynasty built on martial prowess, this was a source of lifelong shame, a vulnerability he compensated for with relentless displays of strength and dominance. This psychological cocktail produced a ruler who craved absolute control yet was temperamentally unsuited to the patient, calculating work of governance. He announced his intention for personal rule, a direct rejection of the Bismarckian model where a strong chancellor managed the state. Wilhelm wanted no pilot, no grey eminence whispering counsel. He desired to be the sole source of power and vision, the star of his own imperial drama. The result was a foreign policy that resembled a series of startling, disconnected scenes rather than a coherent play. He publicly cheered for the Boer farmers fighting the British Empire in South Africa, a gratuitous insult to a nation he supposedly sought as an ally. He gave rambling, provocative interviews to foreign newspapers, casually musing on military matters and alienating entire governments with a single quoted phrase. He constantly meddled in the work of his own diplomats, sending personal telegrams to other monarchs that undermined official channels and created chaos. Where Bismarck had been a grandmaster moving pieces with cold precision, Wilhelm was a man pounding the chessboard with his fist, startling everyone but checkmating no one. To the watching capitals of Europe, London, Paris, and St. Petersburg, this was deeply alarming. The German Empire was no longer a predictable entity guided by a known, if ruthless, logic. It was now a potential loose cannon, its immense industrial and military power coupled to the mercurial impulses of a single man who seemed to value theatrical impact over strategic outcome. The diplomatic crises of the early 20th century did not begin with Germany, but Wilhelm's personal rule ensured that every one of them was deepened, every misunderstanding magnified, and every path to peace made that much more treacherous to find. Bismarck's foreign policy was a masterpiece of delicate, interlocking parts, a diplomatic clockwork designed to run in perfect, peaceful balance. His core objective was simple: to keep Germany secure by ensuring its most dangerous rival, France, remained isolated and friendless, simmering in the bitterness of its defeat but unable to find a powerful ally for revenge. To achieve this, he built a web of treaties that seemed to defy logic, binding Germany to powers that were themselves rivals. The cornerstone was the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary, a firm military pact promising mutual aid if Russia attacked either. This secured Germany's southern flank and gave it a reliable, if sometimes troublesome, partner. But Bismarck's true genius was revealed in his handling of Russia. He knew that pushing the Russian Tsar away would inevitably drive him toward Paris. So, in a move that stunned the diplomatic world, he negotiated a secret agreement with Russia called the Reinsurance Treaty. This pact promised that Germany would remain neutral if Russia were attacked by Austria-Hungary, and Russia would do the same if France attacked Germany. It was a breathtaking act of diplomatic jiu-jitsu, a promise that directly contradicted the spirit of his alliance with Austria. For Bismarck, this was not dishonesty, it was high-wire statecraft. The system worked because he alone understood its precise tensions and balances, personally managing the contradictions to prevent any one power from feeling cornered or desperate. France remained alone, and peace, however fragile, was maintained. This intricate clockwork depended entirely on the skill of its watchmaker. When Kaiser Wilhelm II and his new advisors let the Reinsurance Treaty lapse in 1890, they saw it as an act of straightforward honesty, a rejection of Bismarck's convoluted scheming. They believed a simpler, more forceful German posture would command respect, but from St. Petersburg the view was utterly different. The Russian court saw the non-renewal not as a policy shift, but as a deliberate and profound snub, a clear signal that Germany was now firmly in the Austrian camp and considered Russia an enemy. Humiliated and fearing isolation themselves, the Russians did exactly what Bismarck had predicted. They turned westward. In 1894, France and Russia signed a formal military alliance, a historic pact between a republican democracy and an absolute monarchy, united by their shared fear of Germany. The nightmare of a two-front war, with enemies to both the east and the west, was now a concrete plan etched onto military maps in Berlin and Paris. Bismarck's greatest strategic achievement lay in ruins, dismantled by the very man who had dismissed him. Germany's position grew more precarious with every passing year. Across the Channel, British statesmen watched the Kaiser's naval-building program with growing alarm. The relentless launch of new German dreadnoughts was not seen as a quest for prestige, but as a direct challenge to British survival. The historic rivalry between Britain and France, centuries old, began to melt away in the face of this common German threat. In 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale, not a full military alliance, but a sweeping colonial agreement that settled all their overseas disputes. It was a handshake of understanding, a signal that they would not fight each other. From this friendly understanding, a military conversation naturally began. Finally, in 1907, Britain reached a similar understanding with Russia, settling their competition in Central Asia. This series of agreements, the Franco-Russian Alliance, the Entente Cordiale, and the Anglo-Russian Entente, formed a loose but powerful coalition known as the Triple Entente. To German eyes peering out from the center of the continent, this was not a series of separate peace treaties among others. It was a noose. They saw a ring of hostile powers from the French ports on the Atlantic, through the British fleet in the North Sea, to the vast Russian armies in the east, all connected by treaties and railway lines. The term they used was Einkreisung, encirclement. It fueled a national paranoia, a deep-seated belief that jealous rivals were conspiring to deny Germany its rightful place and strangle its growth. Every diplomatic incident, every colonial squabble, was now viewed through this lens of existential threat. The web Bismarck had woven to ensure peace had been torn apart, and in its place, a new, far more rigid structure had formed, one that turned Europe not into a balance of power, but into two armed camps, each viewing the other's every move as a potential first step toward war. The clock was no longer ticking, it was counting down. The final, fatal spark came from a city most Europeans could scarcely find on a map. On a sunny June morning in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was riding in an open car when a young Serbian nationalist stepped from the crowd and fired 2 pistol shots. The Archduke and his wife were dead within minutes. The political murder sent shockwaves across the continent, but in Vienna, it was seen not merely as a tragedy, but as a long-awaited opportunity. For years, Austrian officials had viewed the small, independent kingdom of Serbia as a dangerous source of nationalist agitation, constantly stirring up trouble among the Slavic peoples inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The assassination was the perfect pretext to finally crush Serbia, to eliminate it as a political threat once and for all. But Austria-Hungary could not act alone. It needed the absolute assurance of support from its powerful ally, Germany. What happened next is one of the most debated decisions in modern history. Kaiser Wilhelm II and his Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, after briefly consulting with military advisors, gave Austria-Hungary a promise of unconditional support. This was the infamous blank check. Germany pledged to stand by Austria-Hungary no matter what course it took, even if that meant risking a major European war. Why would Berlin issue such a reckless guarantee? The answer lies in a pair of intertwined and catastrophic miscalculations. First, German leaders were convinced, absolutely certain, that Russia would not actually go to war to defend Serbia. They saw the Tsar's government as weak and vacillating, unlikely to risk everything for a Balkan-client state. Second, they believed that even if Russia did react, the conflict could be kept localized, a short, sharp, punitive war between Austria and Serbia that would humiliate Russia and solidify German dominance on the continent without a wider explosion. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, rooted in a profound misreading of Russian resolve and the interconnected nature of European alliances. Emboldened by the blank check, Austria-Hungary delivered a brutal ultimatum to Serbia on July 23, 1914. Its terms were so severe, so intrusive into Serbian sovereignty, that they were designed to be rejected. Serbia, surprisingly, agreed to almost all points, but Austria, determined for war, declared the response unsatisfactory and declared war on July 28. The dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. Russia, true to its alliance with fellow Slavs and fearing Austrian ambition, ordered a general mobilization of its vast army on July 30th. This was the moment the German war machine, built and refined for decades, was triggered. German military doctrine was built on a single, inflexible plan, the Schlieffen Plan. Its logic was born from the fear of a two-front war. The plan demanded that Germany must first knock France out of the fight with a lightning-fast, overwhelming attack in the west, and only then turn its full force against the slower, mobilizing Russians in the east. Speed was everything. To achieve the rapid encirclement of the French armies, the plan required the German army to march through neutral Belgium, whose borders were guaranteed by treaty, including by Great Britain. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, it declared war on France, and its armies began to flood across the Belgian frontier. This violation of Belgian neutrality was the final, decisive act of aggression. It transformed the conflict from a continental crisis into a moral crusade. In London, the British government, which had been agonizingly divided, now had a clear and compelling casus belli, the defense of a small, neutral nation and the sanctity of treaties. Britain issued an ultimatum demanding German withdrawal from Belgium. When it expired unanswered at midnight on August 4th, the British Empire was at war with Germany. The Balkan spark had ignited the European powder keg. The mystery that hangs over those frantic July weeks is not one of accident but of deliberate choice. German leaders, trapped by their own military timetable and blinded by hubris, chose to risk a world war believing they could control the chain reaction. They gambled that Russia would back down, that Britain would stay out, and that victory would be swift. In every single assumption, they were catastrophically wrong. The empire Bismarck built for security had, through a series of arrogant miscalculations, marched itself directly into a trap of its own making, a war on two fronts against a coalition of the world's greatest empires. The next 4 years would test the very soul of the German nation, forging a new kind of horror from the very industrial prowess that had once been its pride. The German armies moved with a terrifying clockwork precision. In those first weeks of August 1914, the plan unfolded exactly as the generals had drilled for years. Through Belgium and into northern France, the vast grey columns advanced, a human tide supported by thundering artillery and the new, terrifying machine gun. At home, the public was swept up in a wave of euphoria. Newspapers spoke of glorious victories, of enemy forces shattered, of a war that would be over by Christmas, a repeat of the swift triumph over France in 1870. This was not just patriotism, it was a national fever dream, a belief that German discipline and technology would deliver a decisive, lightning victory. The early reports seemed to confirm it. The Belgian fortresses at Liege and Namur, considered impregnable, fell to massive German siege guns. The French offensive into Alsace-Lorraine was bloodily repulsed. By early September, advanced German cavalry scouts could see the Eiffel Tower on the horizon. Paris itself seemed within grasp. The Schlieffen Plan, that intricate blueprint for total victory, appeared to be working perfectly. Then, at the River Marne, just east of Paris, the machine jammed. Exhausted from a month of constant marching, their supply lines stretched thin. The German right wing had drifted away from its precise timetable. A gap opened between two armies, French and British forces, using every available resource including Parisian taxis to rush reinforcements to the front, launched a desperate counterattack into this breach. What followed was not a single battle, but a chaotic, sprawling collision along a front of over 100 miles. For a week, the fate of France hung in the balance. The German advance shuddered to a halt. The order came to retreat to more defensible positions along the river Aisne. The war of movement was over. In its place came a new, horrifying reality. Both sides began to dig, first shallow rifle pits, then deeper trenches, then vast, labyrinthine systems of fortifications that soon stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The Western Front was born, a 400-mile scar across the face of Europe. This was a form of warfare for which no one was prepared, a grinding, industrial-scale slaughter that consumed men and material with a voracious appetite. The opposing trench lines, separated by a desolate wasteland of mud, shell craters, and rusted wire called no man's land, became a world of their own. Soldiers lived in a subterranean hell of rain, rats, and rotting corpses. Offensives were exercises in futility. After days of artillery bombardment intended to obliterate the enemy, waves of infantry would go over the top, only to be mowed down by machine guns that had survived the shelling. Gains were measured in yards at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. Battles like Verdun and the Somme in 1916 became synonymous with senseless carnage, meat grinders that bled the French and British armies white, but which also drained Germany's vital strength. This was a war of attrition, a contest of endurance for which the German High Command had no answer. Their plan for a short war had evaporated, and they were now locked in a struggle they could not win by simply holding the line. Yet a starkly different war was being fought in the East. Here, against the vast but poorly equipped Russian Empire, the German army, often led by brilliant commanders like Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, achieved staggering successes. In August 1914, they encircled and destroyed a Russian army at Tannenberg, a victory that made Hindenburg a national hero. For 3 years, the Eastern Front remained mobile, a war of sweeping maneuvers and encirclements. The Russian army, though immense, was plagued by shortages of rifles, ammunition, and competent leadership. By 1917, the strain broke the Russian home front. Revolution erupted, the Tsar was overthrown, and the new Bolshevik government, desperate for peace, sued for an armistice. In March 1918, at Brest-Litovsk, Germany imposed a draconian peace treaty. Russia lost a third of its population, most of its coal and iron resources, and all of its territories in the Baltic and Poland. It was the most punitive settlement in modern European history, a victor's peace that created a vast German sphere of influence in the East. This Eastern triumph created a profound and deadly illusion in Berlin. While the army in the West was being slowly bled dry in the trenches, the High Command, now effectively a military dictatorship under Hindenburg and Ludendorff, looked at the map of the East and saw not a separate theater, but a reservoir of new hope. With Russia defeated, they could now shift dozens of veteran divisions from east to west. The resources of Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, would feed the German population and army. They believed they had won the war on one front, and with one final, colossal effort, they could win it on the other. The staggering human cost of the past 3 years was reinterpreted not as waste, but as a painful prelude to ultimate victory. This dangerous miscalculation, this belief that victory was still possible through sheer force of will, would lead directly to the final, desperate gamble that sealed the empire's fate. A gamble that ignored the crumbling foundation at home and the fresh, relentless power now arriving from across the Atlantic. While German generals studied maps of conquered eastern lands, a far more intimate war was being lost in the nation's own kitchens and factory floors. The British naval blockade was a silent, strangling weapon, a wall of steel ships that sealed Germany off from the world's oceans. It meant no imported grain from America, no fertilizer from Chile, no fats or proteins from overseas colonies. The effects were slow, insidious, and then catastrophic. By the winter of 1916, the situation turned desperate. A failed potato harvest collided with the blockade's relentless pressure, and the government was forced to ration what little was left. The staple food for millions became the humble turnip, a vegetable normally fed to livestock. This was the turnip winter. Families survived on turnip soup, turnip bread, and turnip jam. Malnutrition soared, especially among children and the elderly. The average adult's calorie intake plummeted, and diseases like tuberculosis and rickets spread through weakened populations. The home front was no longer a source of strength. It was a landscape of hollow cheeks and deepening despair. This physical hunger ignited a political one. The Burgfrieden, the civil peace declared at the war's start, where all parties pledged to support the government, shattered under the weight of endless sacrifice. Workers in the very munitions factories fueling the war watched their children go hungry while industrialists reaped enormous profits from military contracts. The resentment boiled over. In April 1917, over 200,000 workers in Berlin walked off the job, demanding not just bread but peace and political reform. These were not fringe radicals, but the skilled laborers who kept the war machine running. The strike wave spread to other cities, a clear signal that the patriotic unity was a brittle facade. The empire was now fighting two wars, one against foreign enemies and another against the disillusionment of its own people. From this fertile ground of exhaustion and anger, radical seeds began to sprout. While most socialists had reluctantly supported the war in 1914, a small, fierce minority had always opposed it. Their leaders were figures like Karl Liebknecht, the only member of the Reichstag who voted against war credits, and the brilliant theorist Rosa Luxemburg. They formed the Spartacus League, named after the slave who challenged Rome, and they argued a devastating point. This was not a war of national defense, but an imperialist slaughter that only served the rich. They began agitating openly for an immediate end to the fighting and a revolution that would overthrow the Kaiser, dismantle the capitalist war machine, and establish a socialist republic. Their voices were still a minority, but in the echoing halls of hungry tenements and grimy factory yards, their message found a growing, desperate audience. The external front lines in France and Belgium were static, but a new, invisible front line was being drawn through every German city, between those who believed the war could still be won and those who believed the entire system had to be lost. The empire's foundations, once forged from iron and coal, were now turning to dust, eroded from within by a slow tide of starvation and a rising whisper of revolution. The map of the East was a siren song of victory, and the German High Command could not resist its call. With Russia shattered and 1 million veteran soldiers now available, Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff saw a fleeting, final window of opportunity. American troops were landing in France, but not yet in decisive numbers. The plan was brutally simple: launch one colossal, war-winning offensive in the West before the fresh American army tipped the balance irrevocably against Germany. This was Operation Michael, the beginning of the Kaiserschlacht, the Emperor's Battle, a last desperate roll of the dice with the entire empire as the stake. In the foggy dawn of March 21, 1918, along a 50-mile front, a hurricane of steel and fire erupted. For 5 hours, the greatest artillery bombardment of the war pounded British positions, a deafening orchestra of destruction mixing high explosive with poison gas. Then, specially trained stormtrooper units, lightly armed and moving with terrifying speed, infiltrated the shattered lines, bypassing strongpoints to spread chaos deep behind the trenches. The initial breakthrough was stunning. For the first time since 1914, the Western Front ruptured. German armies advanced up to 40 miles in places, a distance that had taken years of blood to gain in previous battles. By early June, they were again on the banks of the Marne River, and their long-range artillery, the so-called Paris gun, was shelling the French capital. The front lines were now closer to Paris than at any moment since the first desperate months of the war. Panic gripped the Allied governments. It seemed the German gamble might actually work. Yet this breathtaking advance concealed fatal structural flaws. The stormtroopers were the Empire's finest, but the regular infantry following behind them were exhausted, underfed, and often more interested in looting the Allied supply depots they overran than in pressing the attack. The offensive had no single, coherent strategic objective like capturing a vital port or encircling a major army. Ludendorff's stated goal was merely to punch a hole in the line and see what happened, a tactic of tactical brilliance but strategic blindness. Each new breakthrough created a vulnerable bulge in the German line, stretching their own supply routes to the breaking point while the Allies, using their extensive railway networks, fell back toward their own reinforcements and supplies. The German spearheads grew progressively weaker, like a boxer throwing every ounce of strength into a flurry of punches but leaving himself utterly exposed. By late July, the great offensive had spent its fury, stalling in the chalk fields of Champagne. It had gained more territory than any operation since 1914, but at a catastrophic cost: nearly 1 million German casualties, the irreplaceable core of the army. The Empire had thrown its last strategic reserve into the attack, and now it had nothing left to parry the coming blow. That blow landed with thunderous force on August 8, 1918, at Amiens. A combined force of British, French, and now fresh, confident American divisions, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft, smashed into the overextended German lines. German commanders later called it the Black Day of the German army. Entire divisions surrendered without a fight, their morale finally broken. For the first time, the Allies achieved a true breakthrough, and the war of movement returned, but this time it was the German army that was in relentless, bloody retreat. The physical and spiritual collapse was now irreversible. The last gamble had failed, and in failing, it had exhausted not just the army's strength but its very will to fight. The road back led not to victory, but to a reckoning that would soon sweep from the shattered trenches all the way to the Emperor's palace in Berlin. The order from the Naval High Command was a death sentence disguised as honor. In the final days of October 1918, with the army in full retreat and the government secretly seeking an armistice, Admiral Reinhard Scheer and his staff made a chilling decision. They would send the entire High Seas Fleet, the magnificent battleships that were the pride of the Kaiser's world policy, on one final, glorious sortie against the British Royal Navy. The objective was not victory, which was impossible, but the salvation of the Navy's honor through a heroic, suicidal last stand. To the sailors crowded in the steel hulls at the port of Kiel, This was not a call to glory, but an act of monstrous, pointless sacrifice. They had spent the war largely in port, their families starving at home under the British blockade, while the admirals lived in relative comfort. The idea of dying in a meaningless gesture to satisfy the pride of their commanders was the final, unbearable insult. The crews refused to weigh anchor. They extinguished the boilers and began to gather on deck. What started as simple disobedience flared into full-scale mutiny. Sailors arrested their officers, took control of the ships, and raised the red flag of revolution. The spark from Kiel ignited a firestorm. The mutiny spread with breathtaking speed to the other naval bases at Wilhelmshaven and Hamburg. From the ports, the flame leapt inland on railway cars carrying the rebellious sailors. By the first week of November, it had reached the industrial heart of Germany. In Munich, workers and soldiers declared the Wittelsbach monarchy overthrown and proclaimed a Bavarian republic. In city after city, from Cologne to Stuttgart to Hanover, the pattern repeated itself. Striking workers joined with mutinying soldiers and sailors to form revolutionary councils called Workers' and Soldiers' Councils. The German word for these councils was Ret, but their Russian name echoed ominously across Europe. They were Soviets. The ghost of the Russian Revolution, which Germany itself had helped unleash, had now arrived at its doorstep. The old structures of authority, the police, the local garrisons, the civilian administration, simply melted away, replaced by these new, improvised bodies of ordinary people claiming power. In Berlin, the capital was in a state of suspended chaos. Chancellor Prince Max of Baden, a liberal aristocrat desperately trying to negotiate a peaceful transition, understood that the Kaiser's continued presence was a lightning rod for revolutionary fury. He believed only the abdication of Wilhelm II could save the monarchy itself, perhaps for a member of the royal family. On the morning of November 9th, with crowds swelling in the streets and reports of armed Spartacists preparing to declare a socialist republic, Prince Max took a fateful step. He announced the Kaiser's abdication to the press, a move designed to calm the public and preempt a more radical takeover. There was only one problem. Wilhelm II, sulking at his military headquarters in Spa, Belgium, had not yet formally agreed. The Chancellor had effectively dethroned his own emperor in a bid to save the state. The announcement created a power vacuum that lasted mere hours. That afternoon, two competing proclamations echoed across Berlin. From a balcony of the Reichstag, the moderate Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann, hearing rumors that the communist Karl Liebknecht was preparing to proclaim a Soviet republic from the Berlin Palace, acted swiftly. He stepped out to address the massive crowd below and, without any official authorization, declared Germany a democratic republic. His words were meant to channel the revolutionary energy into a lawful parliamentary course. Just 2 hours later, from a balcony of the former imperial palace, Karl Liebknecht of the Spartacus League fulfilled the prophecy, proclaiming a free socialist republic of Germany. For a moment, two Germanys existed in the same city square, but the institutional weight and the remaining loyalty of the army's leadership leaned toward Scheidemann's republic. The monarchy did not fall with a climactic battle or a formal decree. It simply evaporated like a ghost at dawn. Wilhelm II, finally accepting reality, fled across the border into the Netherlands, where he would live in exile for the rest of his life. The other German princes, the kings of Bavaria and Württemberg, the Grand Dukes and Electors whose ancestors had gathered at Versailles to create the empire, abdicated in rapid succession. In a matter of days, the intricate 47-year-old construct of Imperial Germany, with its proud uniforms, its divine right monarchy, and its Iron Chancellor's constitution, ceased to exist. The empire built by blood and iron dissolved not with a roar, but with a bewildered silence, leaving behind a shattered nation and a single, haunting question: what would possibly rise from its ashes? The guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. In a railway carriage parked on a secluded siding in the Campigny forest, 2 German politicians and a military officer signed the armistice agreement dictated by the Allied commander, Marshal Foch. The terms were crushing. Germany had to withdraw its armies from all occupied territory in the West, surrender vast quantities of artillery and aircraft, and hand over its entire fleet of warships. Most humiliating of all, the German army was to retreat east of the Rhine River, allowing Allied forces to occupy strategic bridgeheads on German soil. The war was over, but the soldiers marching home were not a defeated rabble. They returned in orderly columns, their discipline intact, still carrying their weapons. They crossed back into a Germany they barely recognized, a nation now convulsed by revolution, its cities controlled by workers' councils, its emperor vanished. This jarring contrast between the seemingly unbroken army in the field and the political collapse at home created a perfect void for a story to fill. The military high command, led by Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, moved swiftly to shape that story. They had been the architects of the final, catastrophic offensives and the de facto rulers of Germany for the last 2 years of the war. Now, facing the prospect of blame, they crafted a narrative of breathtaking audacity. They claimed the German army had never been defeated on the battlefield. It had been stabbed in the back by traitors on the home front, by socialists who fomented strikes, by cowardly politicians who surrendered, and by Jewish profiteers who undermined the war effort. They gave this fiction a powerful, visceral name, the Dolchstoß legend, the stab in the back myth. It was a deliberate, calculated lie, designed to preserve the honor and political power of the old military elite by shifting all responsibility for the disaster onto internal enemies. The myth took root with terrifying speed. For millions of ordinary Germans, the suddenness of the collapse was inexplicable. Just months earlier, their armies had been deep in France on the verge of victory. Then came revolution, surrender, and humiliation. The stab in the back story provided a simple, emotionally satisfying answer. It transformed a military catastrophe into a moral betrayal. This poisonous legend became the founding grievance of the political right in the new Weimar Republic. Every politician who supported the Republic, every socialist who had called for peace, was branded a November criminal, one of the traitors who had plunged the dagger. The myth crippled the fragile democracy from its birth. How could a government born from what was called a shameful peace ever command true loyalty? The army, though formerly under Republican control, remained a state within a state, its officers' corps steeped in the belief that they had been wronged by the very system they now served. In beer halls and veterans' associations, the story was told and retold, each time growing more elaborate, more venomous. It created a reservoir of bitter resentment, a deep well of national self-pity and rage that would be tapped by every demagogue who promised vengeance and a return to lost glory. The most skillful and ruthless of these demagogues was a former corporal who had been gassed on the Western Front, a man who understood the power of a simple, hateful lie. Adolf Hitler did not invent the stab in the back myth. He weaponized it, making it the central emotional engine of his Nazi movement. The empire was gone, but the legend it spawned in its death throes would prove far more durable and infinitely more destructive than any battleship or border. A nation can recover from a lost war, but can it ever recover from a story that convinces it the loss was never its fault? The new republic's constitution was a document of breathtaking democratic idealism. Drafted in the quiet, cultured city of Weimar, it guaranteed freedoms Germans had never known: universal suffrage for men and women, proportional representation, and robust protections for speech, assembly, and welfare. On paper, it was a radical break from the authoritarian past, a modern framework for a peaceful, progressive Germany. But constitutions are not lived on paper, they are lived in the hearts and habits of the people who must uphold them. And here, in the soul of the state, the ghost of the empire refused to depart. The revolution of November 1918 had changed the political roof, but it left the entire supporting structure of the old regime intact. The bureaucrats who filed the papers, the judges who interpreted the laws, the school teachers who shaped young minds, and above all, the officers who commanded the newly scaled-down army, the Reichswehr, were overwhelmingly the same men who had served the Kaiser. They wore no uniforms of loyalty to the new republic. Their allegiance was to a concept of Germany that was hierarchical, disciplined, and authoritarian. To them, the noisy democracy of Weimar, with its many squabbling parties and its empowered working class, was not a legitimate government, but a temporary, shameful experiment forced upon the nation by defeat. This created a devastating contradiction at the very core of the state. Imagine a magnificent new ship designed for calm seas and fair winds, but with a crew secretly loyal to the old captain who had just been thrown overboard. They would follow orders but without conviction, and they would never believe the new vessel was truly seaworthy. The judiciary became a notorious example. The same judges who had meted out harsh sentences to anti-war activists during the conflict now presided over the trials of those accused of political violence in the Republic. Their bias was glaring. Right-wing extremists who murdered leftist politicians were given shockingly light sentences, often with sympathetic speeches from the bench about their patriotic motives. Left-wing defendants, however, faced the full, unforgiving rigor of the law. The message was clear: the state's authority, in the eyes of its own officials, existed to protect the old order from the new democracy. The economic power structure was equally unreformed. The great industrial cartels, the Krupps and Siemens and chemical giants, had emerged from the war larger and richer than ever. They had no love for the empire's collapse, but they saw in the weak, fragmented parliamentary system a perfect opportunity. They could bankroll nationalist parties, fund private militias like the Freikorps, and pressure governments, all while their monopolistic control over the economy went unchallenged. The socialist dream of nationalizing key industries died almost immediately. The Republic's survival depended on the cooperation of these very magnates, leaving the profound class divisions of the imperial era not just unresolved but more entrenched than ever. Then there was the army, the Reichswehr, limited by treaty to a mere 100,000 men. Its commander, General Hans von Seeckt, deliberately crafted it as an elite, politically autonomous coder, a state within a state. He famously forbade soldiers from voting or engaging in politics, not to protect the Republic, but to keep the army pure and aloof from the democratic fray. The Reichswehr saw itself as the true guardian of the nation, waiting patiently for the day when the temporary embarrassment of democracy would pass. It maintained secret arsenals, conducted clandestine training with forbidden tanks and aircraft in the Soviet Union, and cultivated a fierce internal loyalty that answered to its own leadership, not to the elected parliament. The Republic's monopoly on legitimate force, a fundamental requirement for any state, was a fiction. Its own military was a watchful, disapproving ghost in the barracks. For millions of ordinary Germans, especially the middle classes, professors, civil servants, and shopkeepers who had formed the empire's respectable backbone, the Weimar Republic felt alien. It was associated with chaos, with the trauma of the hyperinflation of 1923 that wiped out their savings, with experimental art they found degenerate, and with a perceived moral laxity. They longed for the stability, the clear authority, and the national prestige they remembered from before the war. Their nostalgia was not necessarily for the Kaiser himself, but for a world where order was unquestioned and Germany commanded respect. This deep cultural yearning made the democratic process itself seem suspect, a source of weakness rather than strength, so the Weimar Republic was born with a fatal birth defect. It was a democratic body trying to function with an authoritarian skeleton, a liberal heart pumping blood into veins still chilled by imperial loyalty. Every crisis, from communist uprisings to right-wing putches, from economic collapse to street brawls between paramilitaries, was handled by institutions that did not believe in the system they were defending. The Republic was not overthrown in a single dramatic coup. It was slowly suffocated by the silent, pervasive presence of the past, by the ghost of an empire that had never truly accepted its own death. This haunting left a vacuum of legitimacy, a quiet, desperate question hanging over the bustling beer halls and polling stations, a question about what kind of authority could finally restore the nation's pride and impose order on the chaos. And into that waiting silence, a new and terrible voice would soon begin to speak, offering answers that were as old as the empire's darkest impulses, but packaged as a revolution. The ghost of the empire did not just haunt the Weimar Republic, it found a new and monstrous body. The Third Reich was not a historical accident, but in many ways the Kaiserreich's darkest and most twisted heir. While the Nazi regime introduced horrors of an entirely new scale, its core ideological DNA was spliced from strands of thought that had flourished under the emperor. The dream of a German-dominated Mitteleuropa, a Central Europe under Berlin's economic and political control, was a common imperial fantasy long before it was rebranded as Lebensraum, living space. The virulent, racial antisemitism of the Nazis was a radicalized, pseudo-scientific version of prejudices that were socially acceptable and politically weaponized in the imperial era, from court preachers to populist pamphleteers. The worship of the military, the belief in discipline and hierarchy as supreme social values, the conviction that Germany's destiny was to be a world power, these were not Nazi inventions. They were the foundational myths of the empire, now stripped of their aristocratic veneer and fed into the furnace of a modern mass movement. The connections were not merely ideological, they were personal. Look at the men who built the Nazi state, the industrialists who bankrolled Hitler's rise. Men like Gustav Krupp were scions of the very dynasties that had powered the Kaiserreich's economic miracle. They saw in the Nazis a force that could crush the unions, restore order, and rebuild a powerful, militarized economy. The diplomatic corps, the civil service, even the army's officer corps, were filled with individuals whose careers and worldviews had been shaped before 1918. They often viewed the Nazi radicals with aristocratic disdain, but they shared a common goal: the destruction of the Weimar democracy and the restoration of a strong, authoritarian Germany. For them, Hitler was a vulgar but useful tool to achieve what the empire had failed to do: secure permanent German hegemony in Europe. Most crucially, the Nazis were masterful archaeologists of imperial resentment. They did not reject the legacy of the Kaiserreich, they promised to resurrect and purify it. Their entire propaganda narrative was built upon the empire's perceived failures and the myths of its death. The stab in the back legend was not just a story they told, it was the emotional bedrock of their movement. They promised to avenge the traitors of November 1918, to erase the shame of Versailles, and to restore the national glory that had been stolen. When Hitler spoke of making Germany great again, his audience did not picture an abstract future. They remembered the powerful, respected empire of their youth or their father's stories. The Nazis presented themselves as the empire's vengeful successor, the force that would finally complete its unfinished project. This perverse continuity reached its apocalyptic conclusion in the East. The Imperial General Staff during the First World War had already drafted plans for a colonial exploitation of conquered eastern territories, envisioning the displacement of Slavic populations to make room for German settlers. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 gave a chilling preview of this ambition, carving a vast German satellite empire out of Russian flesh. The Nazi vision of Lebensraum was this imperial fantasy stripped of all restraint and turbocharged by a genocidal racial ideology. What was once a plan for economic domination and strategic security became a blueprint for total war of annihilation, slave labor, and mass murder. The war the Nazis launched in 1939 was, in their minds, a second attempt to win the war the empire had lost, to finally secure the continental dominance that had slipped from Wilhelm II's grasp. They sought not just to rebuild the old empire, but to build a grotesque racial imperium on its grave, using methods of brutality the old junkers and generals could scarcely have imagined. In this light, the Third Reich appears not as a complete break from German history, but as its most malignant mutation, a regime that took the empire's latent pathologies, its militarism, its expansionism, its social Darwinism and its prejudices, and administered them in a lethal, concentrated dose. The question that lingers is not how such evil could emerge from a civilized nation, but how the unexamined ghosts of a fallen empire can be harnessed and weaponized by those who promise to bring it back to life. The division of Germany after 1945 was a physical amputation along the very fault lines the empire had created. The Iron Curtain did not simply split a nation, it carved through the historic territories of Prussia, Saxony, and Brandenburg, leaving Berlin itself an island of rubble in a Soviet sea. For 45 years, two German states existed, each constructing its own story about the imperial ghost in their shared attic. In the East, the German Democratic Republic declared a clean, revolutionary break. The Kaiserreich was officially dismissed as a feudal and capitalist precursor to the fascism that followed, a historical dead end. Monuments were torn down, street names changed, and the narrative was one of a people's liberation from a chain of oppressive regimes culminating in the socialist state. The past was not reckoned with, it was erased and replaced. Meanwhile, in the West, the Federal Republic of Germany embarked on a much slower, more painful, and ultimately more profound journey. The sheer scale of Nazi crimes forced a generation to ask not just what Hitler had done, but where he had come from. This led to an uncomfortable but necessary archaeology of the national soul, digging back through the Third Reich to examine the imperial foundations. Scholars like Fritz Fischer ignited fierce debates in the 1960s, arguing that the Kaiserreich bore direct responsibility for the outbreak of the First World War, that its aggressive expansionism and authoritarian structures had paved the road to 1933. This Vergangenheitsbewältigung, this struggle to come to terms with the past, became a central pillar of West German identity. It was a conscious rejection of the old imperial virtues of blind obedience and martial pride, replaced by a new ethic of constitutional patriotism, European cooperation, and a profound skepticism of military power. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and reunification followed in 1990, it was not just two states merging, but two starkly different historical memories colliding. The new Germany found itself within borders strikingly similar to those of the old Kaiserreich, minus the lands lost to Poland and Russia after both world wars. This geographic echo immediately sparked anxious debates across Europe. Was this a return of the old Central German powerhouse? Would a united Germany, once again the dominant economic force at the heart of the continent, revert to its old habits? The answer, shaped decisively by the lessons of the empire's catastrophic hubris, has been a resounding and deliberate no. Modern German identity is fundamentally anti-imperial. Its political culture is built on caution, consensus, and a deep institutional commitment to binding its sovereignty within the European Union. The German army, the Bundeswehr, is constitutionally restricted to defense and alliance obligations, a far cry from the saber-rattling of the Kaiser's era. When economic crises like the Eurozone debt turmoil or the refugee influx of 2015 hit, Germany's neighbors often criticized it not for aggression, but for a reluctant, hesitant leadership. This reluctance is the empire's most potent legacy. The trauma of 2 world wars and the Holocaust instilled a permanent aversion to unilateral action and nationalistic grandstanding. Germany today exercises power primarily through economic strength and patient diplomacy within the EU framework, constantly mindful of the shadows its past actions cast. The empire's echo is not heard in marching boots, but in the quiet, persistent determination to ensure that a German-dominated Europe never emerges again. by ensuring Germany itself is so thoroughly European that the two are indistinguishable. The ghost has not been exorcised, but it has been put to work, a silent guardian against the very ambitions that once brought the nation glory and then ruin. From a continent of 300 fragments to a unified colossus, and then back to dust in less than 50 years, the arc of the German Empire is a story of breathtaking ambition and profound tragedy. Its unity was never a gentle merging, but a brutal forging, hammered together by Otto von Bismarck's genius for blood, iron, and political manipulation. Its stability was a brilliant illusion, a surface tension stretched over deep, unhealed cracks between North and South, Protestant and Catholic, industrial baron and factory worker. Its power was real, an industrial and scientific miracle that reshaped the modern world. Yet that very engine of progress also generated the class resentment and militaristic pride that would fuel its downfall. And its end was not a heroic last stand, but a slow, inglorious unraveling, a final, desperate military gamble that broke the army's spirit, leading to starvation at home, mutiny in the ports, and an emperor fleeing into the night as his own people declared a republic in the streets. The empire vanished almost as suddenly as it appeared, leaving behind not just a vacuum of power, but a poisonous legend of betrayal that would haunt the century to come. So we return to the mysteries posed at the start. Was this epic arc an inevitable tragedy, the unavoidable result of nationalist forces colliding across 19th century Europe? Or was it a uniquely avoidable catastrophe, born from a specific series of choices, from Bismarck's cynical realpolitik to Wilhelm II's reckless bluster? Perhaps the most haunting answer lies in the space between. The forces pushing toward German unity were powerful, perhaps unstoppable, but the form that unity took, a rigid, autocratic, and militaristic empire forever seeking its place in the sun, was shaped by deliberate human hands. It was the product of specific decisions to solve political puzzles with war, to manage social unrest with suppression and paternalism, and to pursue global prestige through battleship building and colonial grabs. Each choice, logical to its makers at the time, narrowed the path forward until the only options left were standstill or catastrophe. The empire's ghost, as we have seen, never fully departed. It lingered in the resentments of the Weimar Republic, in the twisted promises of the Third Reich, and in the profound caution of the modern German state. Its legacy is a permanent lesson in the dangers of power pursued without wisdom, of unity enforced without consent, and of glory sought at the expense of peace. What do you think? Was the German Empire's fate sealed from its very founding, or could a different set of leaders have steered it toward a lasting, peaceful destiny? Share your perspective in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into historical mysteries compelling, subscribe for more journeys into the forces that shape our world. The past is never truly dead. Listen closely, and you can still hear the whispers of vanished empires in the corridors of modern power.